Citizen Talks is a podcast series featuring discussions with humanitarians, activists, artists, and changemakers, exploring the global humanitarian issues that shape our society, the world at large. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Citizen Talks. I'm your host Min Kailu, and today we are very pleased to be joined by Hélène. She is the co-founder of Basket pour Toutes, which is in English, basketball for all. Hélène, thank you so much for joining us here today. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start by having you give a brief intro about yourself to our audience for our listeners who may not be familiar with who you are. So can you just give us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what it is that you do specifically?
Yeah, so my name is Hélène, as you said. I'm 23. I grew up and I live in France, in the Paris suburbs. I just finished my law studies. I have a master's degree in human rights law and in international law. And I've been playing basketball since I was 5. And I am one of the co-founders of the collective Basket pour Toutes, which was created about a year and a half ago. And it is a collective that fights the hijab ban in French basketball and just fights for a more inclusive sport.
So can you talk a little bit about your early journey in becoming a basketball player? Like, what drew you to the sport and what kind of motivated you to really commit yourself to that?
I have an older brother, and so I started playing many sports when I was really young, and then at some point I just had to stick with one, and because my older brother was playing basketball, I tried basketball and I kind of stick with it. Since then I was supposedly tall and running fast, and so it was, these were good qualities for basketball, and then I just came to love the sport.
So how old were you when you started to wear the headscarf, and what kind of impact did that have initially on you in terms of your relationship with other players in the different leagues that you were involved in?
I started wearing the headscarf, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. And at that time, I was not playing basketball, I was playing volleyball. I played volleyball for 2 years, but I didn't play in competition because I was not good at it. And so when I started wearing the headscarf, I think some of my teammates were surprised, because for them it's just, one day they see you without, and then the summer goes by and then they see you with the headscarf. So it was a surprise to them. But it didn't change anything to how I played, or I think how I was perceived, at least in volleyball.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit more about Basket pour Toutes? What was the genesis of that organization? Why did you start it? And what kinds of things are you guys working on in response to the hijab ban that happened in French basketball?
Initially, Basket pour Toutes is people coming together, people who started to organize by themselves individually and then came to meet each other. So for myself, for example, I produced with 2 friends a documentary called Dinle, and in that documentary was a basketball player named Salimata Silla, who's also quite well known in France and in French basketball. And she was excluded from one of her games in, I think it was December 2022, just before the documentary was out. And then a few months later, she met Timothy and Haifa, who are the other co-founders of Basket pour Toutes, and she put us in contact, and then we started, very basic things like creating a WhatsApp group. And then as time passed, we felt the need to be more structured and organized, and so that's why we created Basket pour Toutes in October 2023. And we've been doing advocacy work with the help of international NGOs, for example, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Sport and Rights Alliance, Athlete Ally, that have helped us, reach the global opinion. We've produced open letters to FIBA, so the International Federation of Basketball. We produced a letter that was signed by 80 professional athletes on March 2024. And we've also tried to contact the French Federation of Basketball to have a meeting with them. They've never responded. Obviously, we've produced videos. We've just, basic advocacy work to raise awareness on this hijab ban. And we've also organized an inclusive tournament that was open to all women and girls, and which was quite successful actually, because 88 players came to this tournament, which we were really happy about. And obviously we're also just trying to raise awareness on, more generally speaking, the discrimination that the Muslim population is facing in France, and especially women who wear the headscarf.
Actually, I want to talk a bit more about that, in particular about sort of the current situation in French society for Muslim women, because for those of us in different countries, we sort of we kind of look up at France sometimes with a bit of shock. We hear these stories of more repressive policies around control over people's clothing, what they're wearing, and in particular for Muslim women. What has, as the policies seem to get more extreme, what has the actual progression of this been like in your life? What has that experience personally been like for you, as it's one day it's a hijab, and then it's a burqa, and then it's a burkini, and then it's the next thing and the next thing. What's the experience for you as just a young Muslim woman living in France?
I think the progression of anti-Muslim policies and Islamophobia obviously it has started way before I was even born. The first stories and first scandals, I would say, about women and girls wearing the headscarf at school started, I think it was in 1989 or something. So I was not born at that time. But even now that I'm older, we see that each year there's a new policy or a new attempt to restrict our fundamental freedoms. So, for example, in the past, I would say 5 years, last year, girls were prohibited from wearing abayas, so long dresses, to school by the Ministry of Education. Obviously in sports, this year new federations have passed a hijab ban, for example the volleyball federation, the rugby federation. So it's just stories that you hear, and as a Muslim woman, it just feels like they're closing so many doors on you. You can go to school wearing what you want, you can play the sport that you want. If you're a mother, you can, legally speaking, you can accompany your child to the museum with his school and with his class, but it is likely that depending on the school you will face some criticisms or some remarks or verbal abuse. You can't go to the swimming pool wearing your burkini. If you go to the beach, it is also likely, depending on the cities, that you will have the police come to you and say, okay, you should not be here wearing your burkini. And I have so many examples. Schools are also Islamic schools, I would say, not Islamic school, but schools, Muslim schools. In
predominantly Muslim populations in the school.
Yeah, exactly. So you have Catholic schools, and then Muslim schools, there are just a few in France, and the ones that have a contract with the state, they're even rarer. And so in the past couple of years, the two main schools, Muslim schools in France, have seen their financing cut, or are under the threat of their contract being cut by the state. And so it's really in every sphere of your life that it feels like you're targeted. And it's like, okay, what can we do? It's not what do I want to do with my life, it's what can I do in France when I'm a Muslim person, and especially if I'm a Muslim woman wearing the headscarf, because we know that in Europe and in France, more generally speaking, women who wear the headscarf and women in general, Muslim women, are more likely to be the victims of verbal or physical abuse. And so it's just something that you have to live with, because it's everywhere. You cannot ignore that. You cannot not know that.
So even amongst, let's say, the average French population, like, you would say that you would characterize it as not being just at the institutional level. In your society, when you interact with people, what would you say, non-Muslim French people, like, do you feel the same kind of being ostracized, being, you know, this kind of alienation from that part of the society as well?
That's a difficult question, because I think it depends on where you live, who your friends are, what studies you do. Because depending on, you know, who are the people around you, then you won't feel the same, not necessarily hate, but at least misunderstanding, or just, you know, why is she wearing that? So it really depends on where you live. I would say that I think that the majority of the population does not necessarily understand why we wear the hijab, or what Islam is, more generally speaking. But I have, for example, the first week that I started wearing the headscarf, on the Monday, someone came to me on the street asking for directions, and he said, "Assalamu alaikum." And this was the first time in my life that someone in France, not in other countries, but in France, came to me saying "Assalamu alaikum." So I felt pure joy being recognized as a Muslim, and meeting someone from my community and just saying, you know, "Assalamu alaikum," and not just "bonjour." And on the Sunday, so it was 6 days later, an older woman came to me in the street, in my street, asking for directions as well. She was a tourist in the town where I live, but she was verbally abusing. She said she assumed that I didn't know French history, that I was, you know, maybe mad at France for some reason. She said, you should go see this church. It's a beautiful church in my town. You know, it's God's house too. You know, you should learn French history. It's your history too. So she didn't even know me. She came to ask me for something, and she assumed that, you know, I was just, we say in France, there's an expression, an enemy from within. And so this example is just to show, you know, the different kind of meetings and altercations that you can have with people in France. It just depends on who, when, where, I would say. But I think, you know, when you see the public debate, when you see the comments on social media, although it's not necessarily real life, I suppose that there's some French people have a problem with us, and not the other way around.
Yeah, I'm curious, you know, from a personal perspective, because I'm the child of an immigrant, grew up in the United States of America, and you know, also Muslim, and you know, there was a degree of even growing up in New York and speaking, you know, native English, obviously, and being a part of the culture, and not having really any difference from my neighbor in terms of like how I came up in that society. I still very much so, as I got to be older and was more cognizant of these kinds of things, you know, understood that there was a degree of otherness, sort of, that you know, it didn't necessarily, I mean, it obviously didn't manifest as much for me because I'm not like outwardly looking one way or another. I could walk down the street, nobody would notice anything about me, I'm just some guy. But in certain spaces and you know, context, definitely felt like this degree of separation, especially in the past couple of decades, and obviously especially after, you know, 9/11 and all this kind of stuff. And to me, at a certain point, I just got frustrated so much so that I was like, you know, I decided to, you know, separate myself a bit from the society. And I haven't lived in the States for about 7 years, and I've been very satisfied with that decision. Now, of course, I don't mean to make this personal, but you know, there's some relation here.
I
so
understand it.
I wonder, with young people attached to other cultures, in a similar sense, who grow up in countries like, you know, America, France, Spain, Germany, the UK, who have this similar experience, you know, at what point do you feel like, okay, I have to, you know, separate, I'm not a part of this society anymore. Like, I am French, I grew up in France, I understand the culture, I'm immersed in it, it is me to a certain extent, but at the same time I feel that distance growing in myself. Like, for Muslims in France, is there sort of especially younger folks such as yourself, is there almost like is there a growing sense of this amongst younger people? Do you feel this kind of separation? Do you feel like an external pull and an internal push kind of making you think, all right, it's time to maybe move on or think about other options in my life? Like for yourself and generally speaking for people in your peer group, what's the sort of sense that you get from people around that particular issue?
There's a book that was recently published in France that's called La France tu l'aimes mais tu la quittes, so which translates to you love France but you leave it, and it's it's a play of words with from a famous expression in France which goes you either love France or you leave it. And this book shows that Muslim people, especially the ones who are educated, because this study was based on people who did long studies in France, they tend to leave France not because they do not love their country, but because it's so difficult to find a job, to feel accepted as you truly are. So I think there is a movement of within the Muslim population, but I think, as you said, more generally, people who have different backgrounds and whose parents may have been born in another country or grandparents. So I think there is this trend. As for myself, it's kind of difficult. It changes from day to day. I think I live in a bubble in which most of my friends are children of immigrants, not necessarily Muslims, but we have different cultures and backgrounds, and so I feel at ease and at peace with them. And so it's kind of okay. This is our country too. And because I'm mixed race, my mom is French by birth and my dad is Senegalese by birth. I think the relation that I have with France is also different from other people's, because it's really half of my culture, not just because I grew up and I live in this country, but because really I think if I have the culture of the country that I was born in, but also the country that half of my family is from. And I think the question of am I drawn to other countries? Yes, but I think I was drawn to other countries even before I suffered discrimination and the situation worsened, just because the word is broad, you want to see around. But I think when you're Muslim or when you are from another background, the question is different from white French people, because if they want to go to another country for a living, they can, and they will just say, okay, I want to go, I will go. But for us, I feel like sometimes, at least for me, I'm going to speak for myself, it's do I have a responsibility to stay in France to help my communities, I would even say, because I am part of the more privileged part of the population, because I studied, because I'm far well off, and so if I leave, and if we all leave, then the more vulnerable are going to stay, and what's going to happen for them. And I think we have this responsibility compared to this desire to see the world, or this desire to just live in peace. And so the three options just stay in my head, and one day I'm like, okay, I'm going to stay in France, and then the other one is I'm going to see the world just because I can, and why should I feel compelled to stay in France? And another day is just, okay, I have to leave France because I cannot be a lawyer in France, although I did law studies. I cannot do that. I cannot play basketball. If I have children one day, inshallah, I want my children to grow up in a country where they feel ostracized, where they cannot do this, where they cannot do that.
Right.
So that was a long answer to your question, but I hope it answers.
No, I mean, it's complicated. I guess it's like a question of, to a certain extent, can these two identities coexist, right? Can you be French? Can you be, Muslim? Can you remain in that space? And I think a lot of times it seems like, and maybe this is the case for you as well, it depends on, as you said, where you are and the people that are around you, which is sort of paradoxical in many ways, right? Because if you're going to be in the society and you're going to be a part of the society, it's like everyone should, be similar in that regard. But it's like, you go to Marseille and you're going to be completely comfortable as a Muslim with a foreign, quote unquote, foreign identity, because that's primarily the population in that part of the country. Whereas you go somewhere else, which is more, whatever you want to call native, quote unquote, French, you'll probably be a little bit more, it'll be a little bit more difficult. But anyway, What's your perspective on how long-term this whole situation with the sports, the hijab bans, and generally speaking, the increased persecution of Muslims in the country is going to play out? Because it cannot really continue to get progressively worse over time. So, you have people, you're involved in advocacy, you're involved in being an activist. Do you think that there will be at some point a shift in this policy, or do you think that it's going to become sort of even more so? Like, which direction do you see it going in right now based on your experiences being involved in this, advocating, working with people, talking to people? How do you see this playing out in the longer term?
2 years ago, I thought we'd be done by now. I thought we would have changed the rule, which looking back feels very naive of me. But I think we were all optimistic, because it doesn't make sense. Why couldn't I play basketball? And why would the French Federation be so hard-headed about this? But I think as time goes on, it's more difficult to be optimistic and to see when the rule will change. Timothy, so the other co-founder, would say that he's certain the rule will change. Whether it's in 2 months, 2 years, 2 decades, he's certain the rules will change. I think the rule will. In how long, I don't know. What will be the consequences for generations of Muslims in the meantime, I don't know. But I think we have a population and generations that are coming that are more, I wouldn't say determined, because I think past generations were also determined to change things, and they had also other priorities. But I think we are not staying quiet, and I think we're determined to fight. I think the situation will worsen, and we can see with our new government. I don't know how long the government will stay in place, but with the new government that we have, and the public announcement that they made, for example, banning the headscarf in universities, which was not the case until now. It was banned in schools, but not in universities.
That's recent.
That's recent, yeah. The one member of the government just announced that he wants to change the rule. It's just a public announcement. I don't think it will change. I mean, and he doesn't have the power to do so. But I also didn't think that they would ban long dresses in schools either. Right. So you never know. But I think, the situation will worsen, especially just, the targeting, the public targeting against Muslim. I think it will worsen, but I think the resistance, and I hope the resistance will just eventually overcome all these difficulties, and that we will succeed.
I hope so too. Every action is an equal and opposite reaction. So before we have to wrap it up now, unfortunately, but before we do you have any final words that you want to leave for our listeners here? Anything you want to sort of tell them or share with them before we go?
I think it's more a lesson to myself that is quite a recent lesson, is be unapologetic in whatever you do and in however you feel, because we talk about identity maybe crisis, and also it takes some time. I may be impatient. I wanted to change the rule. We wanted to change the rule as fast as possible, but the civil rights movements, wherever they took place. The fight for the liberation of Palestine or Congo, Sudan, wherever it is, it takes time, and so you won't change the rules, you won't change the word in 2 days. You probably won't change the word at all, but it doesn't mean that you have to stop trying. And be patient, because I think the efforts and the fight are worthwhile in themselves.
Very cool. So is there a place that people can go if they want to sort of connect with you or find out about your work? How can they find you online?
We are mostly active on Instagram, so it's Basket pour Toutes, and we have a website as well, but mostly active on Instagram. Okay,
wonderful. Hélène, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here. And for all of our listeners, thank you as well for joining us, and we will see you next time on another episode of Citizen Talks.